Hello, everyone. Today, I want to share a story about my experience working in the funeral industry here in the United States, a job that most people never think about until life suddenly throws them into a situation where they're forced to. And honestly, this line of work completely changes the way you see life, people, relationships, even time itself. Because every single day, you're face to face with someone's loss, someone's grief, someone's final chapter. You end up seeing things that an average person might encounter once or twice in a lifetime, and you see them every week. I've worked as a funeral arranger, I've worked on removal crews, I've prepared bodies. Basically, I've gone through every stage of the process from the very first call from a family to the moment of the ceremony. And a lot of folks think a funeral arranger is just someone who fills out paperwork and schedules a service. But behind those simple words, there's a whole world hidden. In reality, a funeral arranger is part counselor, part salesperson, part negotiator, part psychologist, and sometimes even someone who has to hold on to a family so another funeral home doesn't swoop in and take them. Competition in the funeral industry here is unbelievably intense. Most people imagine the funeral profession as something gentle, compassionate, spiritual. And yes, there is compassion. There has to be. But right next to it runs a very large, very well-oiled commercial machine. And one of the first things that shocks newcomers is how fast funeral homes learn about a death. Sometimes even faster than the family does. Imagine this. Someone passes away at home. The family is still trying to figure out what to do. They just dialed 911. And by the time the paramedics arrive, a funeral home might already be on the way. And now you're the one standing at the door, trying to explain who you are, why you're there, and how you just want to help. How does that happen? Very simply. When emergency dispatch gets a call, sometimes that information quietly makes its way to local funeral homes. Not officially, of course, but the reality is that certain connections exist. And yes, sometimes dispatchers or first responders get a thank you in the form of a couple $100s for forwarding an address quickly. No one talks about it publicly, but the system wouldn't function the same way without it. I've had plenty of moments when I arrived at a home before the family even understood what was happening. One morning I showed up at an address, knocked, and the people inside answered with the most relaxed, casual expressions. I told them what I had come for, and they stared at me like I was speaking another language. "What do you mean? We were with him yesterday. He just had surgery. Everything was fine." And in that moment, you feel like the most intrusive person in the world, but you don't have a choice. Because if you leave, in 10 minutes, another funeral home representative will be at that same door. And 10 minutes after that, another one. In this industry, there is a constant race, a constant tug-of-war. And your job as an arranger is to stay with the family, talk to them, guide them, and not let another funeral home intercept them. Sometimes it looks almost absurd. You're upstairs talking to a grieving family, and you know that two other funeral home reps are literally waiting outside in their vans. Once the conversation starts and the family agrees to talk, the next challenge is the contract. And that's where the sales part comes in. There's a price list, there are services, add-ons, packages, upgrades. And of course, the funeral home wants to sell as much as possible. It's a business. I've had families read through contracts line by line and point at items saying, "Isn't this the same thing as this, just phrased differently?" And honestly, yes, sometimes they're completely right. Some services differ only in wording. But your job is to explain, to justify, to make it clear why everything is listed separately, even if internally you understand that the family sees right through it. Then there are families who simply can't afford much. They look at the final number on the contract and their eyes widen. For those families, funeral homes usually offer a basic package. Cheaper casket, simplified service, fewer add-ons. Discounts are structured in a way that the funeral home still earns what it needs, but the family feels like they're being helped. The savings mostly come from the ceremony itself, and I think that's fair, especially when people truly don't have the money. But there are also the families who assume they're being taken advantage of from the start. They cut you off, tell you they know everything, refuse to listen, refuse to consider more affordable options, even when you genuinely want to help lower their costs. And then there's the behind-the-scenes part that most people don't realize. Funeral homes, dispatchers, police officers, EMTs, all of them are interconnected in one way or another. If a family says, "We'll handle this ourselves," the funeral home may contact the dispatcher, and suddenly the process becomes more difficult for the family. Delays in releasing the body, processing issues, endless callbacks. Sometimes hospitals or coroner's offices can hold a body overnight, just long enough for the family to reach their breaking point and reconsider. The least expensive funeral services start around $500 here. That's the bare minimum. No ceremony, just removal from the medical examiner's office and direct burial. And arrangers earn commission, usually around 5 to 10%. So yes, when a high-value service comes in, arrangers naturally get excited. I remember one case involving a city official. The total arrangement was huge, a big service, expensive casket, everything. I already mentally calculated my commission, and then I got a call from my manager. The mayor's office is handling the funeral through their own preferred provider. Cancel everything. And just like that, the order vanished. There's also no schedule in this job. You might go an entire day without a single call, and then suddenly work all night. You're always on your phone, always waiting, always ready. And that constant readiness wears you down more than anything. Outside of arranging, I also worked on transport crews, picking up bodies, assisting with preparation, driving to funeral homes and cemeteries. And you know the rumors about funeral workers stealing jewelry or valuables. Those rumors exist for a reason. I never personally saw anyone do it, but I've heard enough stories from coworkers to know that sometimes things happened. People are people. Good and bad exist in every industry. During services, we even had a dark inside joke. If the sensor is swinging, the money is flowing. It sounds harsh, but in this industry, the business side never stops, even during a ceremony. And despite everything, the pressure, the competition, the midnight calls, this job teaches you a lot, especially about how fragile life really is. When you face death every day, you start valuing time differently. Working in the funeral industry might look simple from the outside. People think it's just show up, carry a casket, stand quietly during the service, and go home. But in reality, the actual ceremony is maybe 30 minutes of real work. Everything else is waiting, driving, coordinating, dealing with families, or just standing around at the medical examiner's office. And the waiting, the constant waiting, becomes part of your nervous system. But the hardest part of the job isn't time, and it's not even the heavy lifting. The hardest part is dealing with bodies that have already begun decomposing. When decomposition sets in, the smell is like nothing you can ever prepare for. It seeps into your clothes, your skin, even your hair. You can wash your uniform 3 times and still catch a hint of it. Mask or no mask, it doesn't matter. The odor finds its way through. One case I'll never forget involved a man who weighed around 500 pounds. He lived on the 8th floor of an old apartment building with a tiny elevator, the kind you still find in older cities like Chicago or Philadelphia. When we arrived, we realized immediately that lifting him was nearly impossible. Just trying to get him off the floor took everything we had. Our arms were slipping, the sheets we used for leverage would tear, and his body simply wouldn't move in one piece. We ended up having to slide him carefully across the floor, bit by bit, using multiple sheets and repositioning ourselves constantly. It was exhausting, and getting him into the elevator, that was an entire ordeal on its own. Eventually, I had to climb inside first, position myself against the wall, and the rest of the team pushed sections of his body forward until he fit. When the doors finally shut, it was just me and him in that small metal box. For the first time in my life, I felt actual claustrophobia. The elevator crept downward, and I kept praying it wouldn't break down halfway. But the toughest period, emotionally and physically, was during the early years of military deployments and overseas casualties returning home. Morgues across the country were filling up fast. It was summer, the heat was brutal, transportation conditions weren't ideal, and bodies were being moved long distances. The smell in some of those storage areas was overwhelming, thicker and heavier than anything you'd encounter on a normal call. What shocked me the most was a moment when I was standing in this unbearable smell, the kind that makes you dizzy, and a medical examiner's employee stood right next to me calmly eating an apple, just munching away like he was on a lunch break in the park. That image stuck with me. It showed how much a person can change when they work around death every day. There were also moments that were strange, unexpected, or even borderline surreal. One time, someone accidentally mixed up the information for the deceased with the information for the person paying for the funeral. In the U.S., the responsible party listed on a funeral contract doesn't have to be a family member. It can be a friend, a roommate, even a neighbor. That day, we had 2 different funerals scheduled at the same medical examiner's facility. Our crew had dropped off clothing, flowers, and supplies for both cases, but the staff member who delivered everything gave the wrong instructions. He told the morgue workers to dress the wrong person. We arrived at the funeral home, opened the casket during the visitation, and the woman standing there just froze and said, "This isn't my relative." Instant panic. People started gasping, others whispering, some crying. The whole atmosphere shifted in seconds. Thankfully, the pastor stepped in and calmed the room while we raced back to the medical examiner's office to fix the mix-up before things got completely out of control. Then there were the moments when the casket slipped or tipped during the lowering process. It happens far more often than people would ever imagine. Sometimes the grave is just a few inches too narrow, or the ground is too soft, or the straps malfunction. And when you're the one who dug the grave, which I occasionally did early on, it's twice as embarrassing. You think everything is perfect, and then suddenly everyone is staring at you because the casket won't fit properly. One of the most unusual cases I ever dealt with involved a woman who passed away alone. She had identification with her, but after an extensive search, no relatives could be found. The city assigned her burial to our funeral home. But her body had been stored in a corner of the medical examiner's cooler for nearly 2 weeks. And because the cold airflow was strongest in that corner, she'd basically become fused to the metal table by a thick sheet of ice. When we tried to move her, she wouldn't budge. It was like trying to lift a block of frozen concrete. We had no choice but to carefully chip away at the ice around her edges. Dressing her was physically impossible, so we placed her clothing neatly on top of her body, then transferred the entire frozen mass, body and ice together, into the casket. As strange as it sounds, there simply wasn't another humane option. I also assisted in washing and disinfecting bodies, something most people misunderstand completely. It's not like giving a bath. It's a full disinfectant wipe down with special solutions. You clean the hair, the face, the arms, the legs, everything. This is done to reduce bacteria on the surface. And when you turn a body that's already relaxed and softened after death, gases escape. It's normal, but it can be unsettling if you're not used to it. But honestly, the hardest part of the funeral business isn't bodies, it's the living. Families in grief react in completely different ways. Some break down crying, others become angry at everyone. Doctors, EMTs, funeral workers. Some freeze and can't speak. Others start asking rapid-fire questions because they're trying to stay in control of something. Anything. And you have to stay steady no matter what. During my first 6 months, every family's pain went straight into my chest. I absorbed it all. And that's something you can't do if you want to survive mentally in this field. You have to learn emotional distance, not because you don't care, but because you won't last otherwise. And despite everything, the smell, the physical work, the midnight calls, the emotional pressure, I actually liked this job. It felt meaningful. You help people through the hardest day of their lives. You give dignity to someone's final moments. There's something extremely human about that. But I left. Partly because the pay wasn't enough for the responsibility and stress. And partly because there's no real career ladder in most funeral homes unless you go to mortuary school and become a licensed funeral director. If you don't take that path, you can spend years in the same position. Sometimes I think about how different things could be if the government handled funerals more directly, with standardized pricing and oversight. It would make funerals more affordable. Families wouldn't be pressured. There wouldn't be competition over addresses or any of the behind-the-scenes games that happen now. Funeral homes provide jobs, they serve a real need. I'm not saying they're bad, but the system as a whole isn't ideal. Thanks for listening. I hope sharing my experience gives you a clearer picture of what really happens behind the scenes in the American funeral industry, a world most people only encounter once, but where I spent years of my life.